Damien O'Connor.
Mr Chairman, Labor welcomes this piece of legislation into the House, and indeed it wasn't without the proactive cooperation of the Labor opposition that would be here. We made the offer to the Minister in the knowledge that it wasn't on the order paper, and indeed we were going to close Parliament tomorrow without this legislation passing, and there are members of the Primary Production Select Committee on the government side there and on this side who have put a lot of time and effort into this, and two of whom actually gave their valedictory speeches today, Eric Roy and Shana Dern, who have followed the fisheries legislation, in fact, from 97 right through, and will welcome this piece of legislation, giving effect to the intent of the legislation for some time. And in 97, when the legislation was passed, there was, through the efforts of my colleague Graham Kelly, actually, in this House, an initiative to ensure that anyone working on fishing boats catching New Zealand fish in our economic zone should be paid New Zealand rates of pay and in conditions that we would expect for New Zealanders. We were given assurance, and the legislation stated that in 97, but actually by early 2000 it had become apparent that we weren't guaranteeing those proper conditions for a lot of foreign fishermen who were coming in on foreign boats catching fish. So there was an inquiry, and in fact Labor and Government sought further assurances from the Department of Labor at the time and from the Maritime, in fact the Guild as it was then, to give better security and protection for fishermen who travelled a long way, came in these boats that were not ideal. They weren't new. Some might call them rust buckets. I guess they could still float. But they had come into New Zealand waters to catch fish under contract to New Zealand companies. Mr Chairman, it then, through some very sad situations, the Ouyang 70, a number of other situations at Lyttelton Port where boats had been tied up, it had become apparent that in fact our law was not being properly implemented. And I acknowledge the government conducted a ministerial inquiry. Our ex-colleague, the Honourable Paul Swain, did a very good job, came back to the government with recommendations, and indeed that piece of legislation came to the Primary Production Select Committee. And on balance it was decided that reflagging under the New Zealand flag was the most appropriate way to protect the workers who were working on those boats catching New Zealand fish in our economic zone for New Zealand companies who were profiting from this, but they were effectively being treated like slaves. And in fact, in passing this legislation, we shouldn't pat ourselves on the back too much, because as TV article just over a week ago disclosed, similar conditions are being applied to workers from the Philippines in the Christchurch rebuild. So I say to the government, in praising them and assisting them here, we've got to look at that situation here in New Zealand, in Christchurch, and dare I say on odd occasions with RSE workers throughout the country. But I'll put that to one side. Mr Speaker, Labor, as I say, prompted the government to take the initiative to introduce the bill and have it passed. And we would have had it passed tomorrow if it wasn't for the Maori Party. And I have to say it is absolutely shameful and disgraceful that a party in this House, here to protect Maori people up and down this country, many of whom own quota, own the right to access fisheries, and in fact have many of their own people employed on fishing boats up and down this country, they refused to give leave for us to pass this legislation in a way that would have seen it in place by 2016, as proposed in the bill, but passed prior to the closure of this Parliament, Mr Speaker. I think we could have all held our heads up high and said, because it required the leave of all parties to come in and pass this, because we know it is not right, we know it's unjust, and we know that we've had people treated like slaves in New Zealand in the 21st century. Disgraceful.
That's right.
And I acknowledge the government, Mr. Chairman.
Honourable Damien O'Connor.
I acknowledge the government for its good work, the collaboration and cooperation of the Select Committee and all the members of it to progress it. I have to make mention of a last-minute an amendment to the legislation after the Select Committee had, in fact, gone through it extensively, and there were exemptions put up by the Minister. I'm not going to ask him why, because he's pulled them back now, but there were exemptions for those who held quota under treaty settlements. I accept the reality that there are quota parcels owned by small iwi groups who have to, or who have chosen to get that fish caught by foreign charter vessels because it's the only way they can realise the benefits of that quota, or it has been. And so they, and I would hope reluctantly, have utilised the foreign charter vessels to catch their quota and get some benefit from it. Now that's okay in a transitional phase, but this has been going on for too long. These incidents, Oyang 70 others, have been a disgrace and have put New Zealand in the spotlight of international marketplaces, to the point where we've been struggling to sell some of our high-quality fish into Europe because of the slave conditions in which that might have been caught. A real dilemma. The government's moved. I acknowledge the Minister. But for the Māori Party to block this, I find it abhorrent and disgraceful when everyone else in this Parliament has agreed that we should move it on under urgency, move it through because of its wonderful outcome for our international reputation, ultimately for quota owners as well, because I think this Parliament, if it thought that those small iwi quota owners were going to get rorted or squeezed, I think we would have moved to protect them. They should have trusted us and trusted the system to give them due benefit from their quota allocated to them under the treaty settlements. They deserve a fair go. But to get a fair go by way of slave labour is abhorrent to the fairness and fair-minded values of just about each and every New Zealander. So, Mr Speaker, we support the government in passing this through. There's a very good summary of what has happened here through the regulatory impact statement, Mr Speaker. It outlines the dilemmas that we've been facing as a country. Labor wants to move all of our exports from volume to value, move up the value chain. We don't want slaves catching our fish. We want the finest quality fish caught by the best and well-paid and protected workers and fisher people in this country. We've got 140,000+ people out of work. Kiwis will work for the right incentive, pay them a decent wage on these boats and sell high-quality fish into Europe and any other market, and there's money there for everyone. For the workers on the boats, for the boat owners, for the quota owners, and for the people who are selling our fish into the market. That's what Labor stands for. That's what we want to build across all the primary sectors. Here's an opportunity to free us from the shackles of slave labour catching our fish and to move on. I trust that the blockage by the Māori Party now doesn't unnecessarily delay the passage of this bill. Labor commits, when we are in government on September the 21st, that this will be the highest priority, and we will move to complete the passage of this legislation. And shame on the Māori Party for blocking this, and acknowledging the good work, as I say, of my colleagues on the Select Committee. We did look at this from a wide perspective and trying to protect the interests of all those involved. But ultimately, the flagging of these vessels as New Zealand vessels ensures proper standards of health and hygiene and health and safety. So, Mr Speaker, I won't say any more than that, other than to say Labor supports this bill, the passage of it through the committee stages. We would have liked to have seen it go through the third reading yesterday, but alas, the Māori Party blocked that. Kia ora.
I call Stephen Browning.
Thank you, Mr Chair.